I will. Sorry, it was some connection. Now I came back.
Morning, morning.
Good morning. Good to see you again. And here is our students. Mostly they are in the third semester. And also there is some public join us right now. So Professor Budi just told me that he is still in Tokyo. So I think it's not possible for him to join now. I hope that is okay.
No problem.
Okay. Should we start now?
Whenever you're ready.
Okay. Okay. Mohon mikrofonnya dimatikan terlebih dulu buat peserta yang lain. Peserta mohon diperhatikan mikrofonnya agar dimatikan terlebih dulu. Kita akan memulai kelasnya. Oke.
Kalau udah ajar apa bedanya? Fungsinya coba kan.
Angga Yunanda, tolong mikrofonnya. Oke. So before I start, I would like to read your short bio, but I will read it in Bahasa Indonesia.
Wow,
Okay.
great.
Okay. Oke, buat adik-adik semuanya, Dr. Will Davis merupakan seorang dosen di Academy of Architecture, Università della Svizzera Italiana. Selain itu, Dr. Will juga tergabung di dalam Institute of the History and Theory of Art and Architecture, atau ISA. Kemudian, dia juga merupakan seorang ketua dari SNSF Ambizione Project, Voyaging Vapors, Land Histories of Plantation Architecture untuk proyek 2024 sampai 2024. Serta juga tergabung dalam Associate of Science, Technology and Society Cluster di Asia Research Institute atau ARI, National University of Singapore. Kemudian untuk latar belakang pendidikannya, Dr. Will Davis menyelesaikan doktornya di University of California, Los Angeles pada tahun 2021 dengan proyek disertasi Farm Politics, Warfare, Folklore, dan Architecture. Mohon peserta untuk diperhatikan mikrofonnya. Nah, disertasi ini memenangkan Society of Architectural Historians David D. Brownlee Award. Setelah itu, Dr. Will Davis juga menjalankan postdoktoral di Princeton University pada tahun 2022 sampai 2023. Nah, selain itu, Dr. Will Davis juga merupakan seorang editor di Art Journal di Turin, Italia, dan founding member ANZA, East Africa, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. So, Will, time is yours. Would you like to share the PowerPoint or?
Yes, good morning. So great to see so many people in so many places, people in cars, people in cafeterias. I'm so happy to broadcast this presentation, Abba. And thank you, Rashid, for your kind introduction. I will share my screen. I would also before I really begin, I want to just say if I'm speaking too fast or it's too weird, just raise your hand or say something in the chat, and I can slow down, and maybe Rashid or Kiki can even translate a little bit if that's helpful.
Okay.
I'll let you decide about that. So I'm going to share. I want to try to share this screen. Hopefully that's visible to everybody.
Yes, that's visible.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to talk for between 30 and 40 minutes, and I'll try to take it slow. I've given a version of this lecture several times, and this is the first time I've given it in an Indonesian context, so I'm very excited to hear about your feedback and your thoughts about this presentation materials, and to see what I'm trying to do. Yeah, so thank you so much for this invitation. It's a bit of a challenge to think about this topic, plantation, society, and culture, because it's so broad. It can really encompass everything. I will sketch out what I think an architectural history of the colonial plantation can be through its European version. So I will be jumping from Europe to Sumatra and back and forth and back and forth in this presentation. And I'm excited to hear your feedback. Especially I'll be talking about a villa in Switzerland, in Zurich, in Switzerland. But just to get started, I want to just sort of introduce also my discipline. I'm a historian of architecture, so that means I have a very particular approach to talking about things. I'm always talking about the physical thing. I understand that I'm speaking to a history department, and often that means people are talking about cultural phenomena, societal issues, but they're not necessarily linked to the physical things. I really like architecture as a discipline because all of the history is right there in the physical process, and even in the maps and documentations of the world. And I think it's very useful to kick off with just a big map of the world like this, just to sort of illustrate where I'm coming from. The map on the left, of course, is showing us the tropical band, the tropical belt of the world. So those parts of the area highlighted in red are the tropics. And the map on the right-hand side shows us the former European colonial possessions. In this case, just the British Empire. Already there is a lot of colonial possessions, even in just this one map. But what I think is most interesting is that the big majority of those places follow this map on the left, the tropical band. So the majority following this kind of middle band, which means clearly there was some interest in these hot places where you can grow things. So places where you can grow crops for money. And in this case, of course, plantation environments. So this is just to sort of set the scene, and there's a lot of different ways of understanding what a plantation is, what a plantation does. But I think just for us to, as a really basic starter, there is also climate and history are overlapping perfectly for us to understand it. And it's no coincidence that the European countries follow that tropical band. What does architecture have to do with that? I think that this is, I should just quickly make the definition. Architecture is a visual discipline. We're concerned with like, how do things look? How are they structured? How are they built? what do you use to build them? You use like trees, timber, palm, bamboo, all of these different things you can use to make a building and also to destroy a building. Architecture is therefore very, very wide as a discipline. You can cover anything in the built environment. So when we say design, when I say the word design, you might think of, you know, like a nice coffee bar or fancy graphic design or a nicely designed website or something. But actually, it means everything that is designed in the environment. And also historically, in history, everything has been designed by somebody. So I think it's just important for me to sort of lay out these foundations. Architecture, as in buildings, are things that mediate an environment. A building is a way of controlling an environment. And the conceptual formation of the plantation evolves with architecture. It signifies certain things. So that's just to get us started. My slides are all visible, okay? I hope nobody's shouted anything in the chat yet, so I'm just going to move that over here in case I need to see anything from the chat. All right, great. Okay, good. So I've structured these like 3 talks in 1, 2, 3, plantation, society, culture. So this first talk is all about house. It's called the villa. The next one I'll give is called the forest. And then the third one I'll give is called the camera. So it's going to be a lot of fun. And I'm going to provide you with a lot of information. And I hope it's not too much. And we get some really useful and exciting feedback and comments. So feel free to just straight away put your questions in the chat in English or Indonesian as we go along, and I can address things either through or at the end, depending how it goes. So this is the first presentation, and I'm talking about the villa. And here it is. This is called the Villa Patumba. It's built in 1885 in a neighborhood in Zurich, which is a big city in Switzerland. It was located next to a lake. It's very large, and it has an unusual name for a villa in Switzerland. It's called Patumbak. It's named after the plantation that it was built from. So it was named after the place that provided the profits. So for me, this villa is like super fascinating because it enables us to talk about a plantation in Europe, in a European setting. The villa, there are many villas like this, and these plantations funded them, and they provide a big opportunity for us to reflect on imperialism and the transactions that created this possibility. I consider this villa as a physical example of all of these colonial flows of money, of power, and I think that, there we go. The Villa Patumba that I consider here illuminates all of these intermingling flows of form and culture and taste. It provokes us to understand the plantation in Europe as well as tropics. So this is a picture of it in a magazine after the construction was completed, because still they didn't have photographs in magazines yet. So I wanted to choose the historically accurate way that it was depicted. And I think it's a really beautiful image because it's so funny. They even put a picture of a lady in there twirling an umbrella. It's like there's a banana plant in the foreground. It seems like the balcony has got little mini palm trees growing on it. And I think it's like you can see already that there is a sense of like an exotic background to this place because of the way that it's being depicted. So this is all information perhaps that is quite familiar. Everybody in this Zoom room is familiar with the name Patumbak. It's the name of the land that the owner of this villa, Karl Furtgott Grob, and his business partner, leased from the Sultan of Sardang in 1871. They initially leased 3,700 acres of land. And by the time they sold off their plantations in 1889, so I'll just keep track of the dates here. So within 20 years, they started with 3,700 acres. And then after 20 years, they sold them off at 63,000 acres. So they went from 3,700 to 63,000 acres. And actually, their estates were so large that even the average tobacco plantation was a much smaller. Theirs were huge. They covered a strip of land roughly 7 kilometers wide, starting even quite close to Belawan, the port, and they went 40 kilometers all the way to the south. They're pretty interesting, their plantations. As we know, in Medan, around the city, which takes its name from the former plantations, many Europeans gave them European names. You've got Helvetia, Sentis, Winterthur, Ludwigsburg, Germania. Unusual was that these businessmen, Grob and Nair, gave their estates local names. They leased the land from the Sultan that was old forest, old growth forest, and their plantations went so far south that they hit the border of Tanah Karo. So they hit the very edge of the mountainous region as we're getting close to Sibayak and Sinabung. So some of the historians here in Switzerland have speculated that they gave their estates local names like Patumbak in order to emphasize juxtaposition, natives and the plantation. I'm not really sure why they gave their estates local names. Maybe it was simply practical. Maybe it was because perhaps it was easier just to keep the original name. There has been sort of speculation about this. But if people have thoughts, stick it in the chat. So this is just an image of the administrator's house on the Patumba estate. This is where a house like this is where a sort of estate manager would have lived. I've chosen to show this image because I think it's an interesting image. There's a few things happening here. We can see the men in white, so you get to know straight away who the European is. But you also see that the houses are in the background, and in the foreground, so close to us in the photograph, is this strange little tower with like a little house roof. And this was a very basic watchtower, a sort of rudimentary kind of watchtower. And it's a reminder that the plantation of 1870s, back at this time, was very militarized. They have to be to keep control of who's around. These tobacco plantations have been described as really like factories on the land. So instead of having a factory inside a building, the factory is spread out over the land. And of course, most of you already know this, and this is not news, but plantation workers lived on the estate. They had living in barracks. They were segregated by race or by ethnicity. And the workforce in Sumatra in the 1870s is mostly made up of Javanese and Chinese workers who were brought in from elsewhere. So I'm on this very beautiful photograph. It's sort of quite a, as I mentioned, architecture is a very visual discipline. So we do look at images a lot, especially when you're like me and interested in history of architecture. I think that this is a fascinating image. And I'm wondering if you're able to see this image clearly on your screen, if anybody can tell me what they can see in the distance on the image. Are people able to see that close? If you can see what's on the horizon, maybe you can write it into the chat and I can see if people are able to see that in much detail. I'm very curious if people are. So just go ahead. These estates, and while I'm waiting for people to write something in the chat, the estates were very strictly regulated around a process of growth. So you have harvesting, you have curing, and you have fermenting for tobacco. And this process follows a cycle of 3 planting seasons. You have, and I'll give it away, the curing sheds, which we can see on the horizon, are all these drying barns. You can see these massive buildings on the horizon of the image. I'm not so sure if you can see my mouse as I mouse over the image here, but you can see these large buildings on the
Yes.
horizon very faintly. That's why I love this image. It's not just crops growing in a field, but there are also these sort of floating kind of crazy buildings. Actually, they look a little bit like spaceships, like UFOs landing on the field, because they're so big. Even just technologically, it was kind of fascinating that they could build these buildings to be so large. We know that historically, many of the builders of these buildings were ethnic Karo, Batak, people coming down and using expertise in large-scale construction with bamboo and palm and timber. So the reason that I'm showing this image is for several reasons. You know, it's a very beautiful image. It's very clearly taken, but you can also see that these buildings in the background, they would actually move. They would be taken down and then moved to a different location because the crop cycle also has to move. So it's a very interesting image to think about. For every particular season, you have these temporary huge structures that would move, and an estate could have as much as 50 of them. So it's extremely labor intensive, also extremely volatile, actually, because of the conditions. So we bounce back to Europe again now, and we go back to the villa. We're going to come back to Sumatra again and back to Europe. So we keep going back and forth. So I switch gears again. So the Patumbak plantation provides the money, basically, the possibilities to create a kind of fantasy building. You see that on this building, you don't have enough detail to really see it, but actually there are these tigers and lions on the facade of the building. In the stained glass windows, so in the painted windows, in the roof of the building, they have dragons painted. The name of the plantation, as you can see, is written right across the top of the building, Patumba. It's kind of interesting. Building in Switzerland, in Zurich, has got a giant name from Sumatra spread across the top of it. And that's still there today. So it's a really, really interesting building. It was actually very love-hate in Switzerland. Some people loved it, some people hated it because they said that it was too grand, it was too fancy, essentially. And today, interestingly, it's actually, this building is a museum, and it's actually the headquarters of the Swiss Heritage Society. So that's kind of interesting. I want to talk a little bit about the Swiss situation, which I think is probably the least discussed in colonial history studies, one of the lesser discussed ones, especially in Indonesia. We don't really talk about Swiss. We talk about maybe the Dutch is the big one. You know, they really, obviously, for obvious reasons, we talk about the Dutch in the Indonesian context. But the Swiss were also there. And I think that there are people who are discussing this today, and they call it colonialism without colonies. It's a very interesting version of thinking about it. You get to have all of the benefits of economic interests, but because you don't have your own colonies, you're weaving your interests into other people's countries' interests. So you don't, by doing this type of operation, you don't have the responsibility. Quite an advantage in some ways. In this way, it relieved them of all of the geopolitical tension that were common to all of the other European metropoles in the 20th century and the 19th century. So today, Swiss colonialism is often recounted as like one of many elements of a very textured past, rather than an embarrassing debacle. So you have France and Belgium and Spain. They sort of have this this character of regret, in Europe today. We're sorry. We didn't mean it. And all of the museums are sort of doing this as well. In Switzerland, it was not so common to have this approach. They would be like, it would just be part of a colorful past, and maybe that they're almost innocent. So this is an ongoing discussion, and these are Patricia Purchert, which I've written on the slide here, is one of the foremost scholars talking about this colonialism without colonies, which is quite interesting right now. And I'm just pointing it out because in some ways, these men that were owning Patumbak, they were following a very well-known path. They copied what other people did. They exchanged knowledge with what other people did. They were doing, they were basically following the Kulturstelsel cultivation system that was requiring Indonesian lands to be given to a portion of export crops. In any case, I will keep moving along. Just wanted to point this thing out. So back to the villa. I think this is a drawing of the building itself from above. This is an architectural plan. And if you're unfamiliar with what an architectural plan looks like, it's quite a useful thing to become familiar with as a historian, as a cultural studies major, or whatever you're majoring in, because you can very, very quickly see how the space is organized and in what way. So we're looking at a bird's eye view, in other words, of a villa here. The villa itself is, we're looking at the actual individual rooms. I'm not sure if you're able to see my mouse on the screen right now, but we can see that this is the street at the bottom here. If you can't see my mouse, maybe just shout and I'll try to describe even more. But this is the main street, and we enter here. And this would be the sort of entry walkway. We take a right, we go into the house itself. And this is this sort of a central part of the house. It's sort of built around squares. In fact, the house is one big rectangle built up of smaller rectangles. And these smaller rectangles are each a different room. In the center, you have what's called like the noble entryway. Karl Grob, the owner of the villa, he called this the Malayan courtyard. It's the Malay courtyard of the house, which is quite interesting. And on the left-hand side, this rectangle is called the men's room. On the right-hand side is the women's room. And in the middle is the salon. So this would be where all of the guests are going to have dinner together. And then after they've had dinner, the women go to the women's room and the men go to the men's room, and they get to have a conversation in private. So that's the plan. This is the section. When I say, so this is maybe a little bit easier to see, but this is the building from the side, and we can also see inside the building. So this is just what I just talked about. So this is the middle area of the villa. We can see the men's room here, and this is the sort of balcony area for the garden. Now, you can't really tell on this plan, but there is a very specific detail which I want to point out, which I think is very, very interesting to think about in relationship to the plantation context. So we're all familiar with the term of, we are also familiar with the history that in the plantation context across Southeast Asia, it was common for people to smoke opium. It was common for people to smoke opium even to build the cities. You know, there has been a lot of research about this, how indentured workers were even relying on this narcotic so that they could actually build these cities. So we know also that opium use 150 years ago was called chasing the dragon. That was the term. I'll type that in the chat quickly so that you sort of remember. The chasing the dragon was the kind of slang, you know, the quick way of sort of talking about this. In this building plan, what is very fascinating that they put a little hole here. You can see that this is the floor. Every one of these horizontal lines is a different floor. And as we get higher, this is a glass ceiling. You can see through. No floor here, no floor here, and a little hole here. This means that the light is going all the way through the building and passing through. And I put these lines on. Now, interestingly, the architects of the building called this little hole the dragon's eye. Now, there's been some speculation about this, that why would they call it the dragon's eye? I think that it's a couple of things going on, because the dragon, of course, is a mythical creature in Europe just as much as in the Asian context. But also there's this relationship to chasing the dragon, and people knew about this in the European context. This is not an unknown thing. It was part of, people understood what it was, even if they'd never, experienced it. I suspect that there was a hint here of referring to the kind of chasing the dragon and having the dragon's eye going through the building that has a little bit of a reference to where it's coming from. And I think that there's this fantasy happening here, that even when you evoke illicit substances, they serve to augment the villa's exotic palette. So the villa becomes even more exotic and strange. It's having this awareness of suffering and pleasure and wealth, that when you take all of those things together in the naming of a way of threading light through the building, you have this way of shaping the building through these experiences of exoticization. So I wanted to point that out and also give you a little introduction to how we look at buildings architecturally in this context. So we switch gears one more time here in this presentation. I'm just past the halfway mark, if you're checking the time. So now we're looking at some letters in an archive in Switzerland. And, perhaps some people are familiar with what we're looking at here. If you know what we're looking at, please just say yes in the chat, then I can see who's paying attention and who's familiar with these images. I'm very curious if people have a sense of what these objects are. So these objects are in a plastic tray in an underground concrete archive in the old botanical garden in Zurich. So it's kind of interesting that in Zurich there's a big botanical garden which was built in the 19th century, and underneath it is a big archive. It's like an underground archive. And this is the archive of the Natural History Museum. This is a bundle of things, letters, which were left behind by the essentially left behind by Karl Grob and Felix Neher, the people who owned Patumbuck. They left all of these things. One might be led to believe that the museum is not really sure how to look after these objects because there is no climate control in this archive. Their material form, they seem to be a little bit weary. If you look closely, you can see that sometimes even the archive number is actually written onto the object. So it's like they haven't really figured out how to look after them properly. So another thing to point out that is that unlike the colonial objects taken from previous colonies, these were not robbed. These were actually given. These bamboo letters were actually intended for their recipients, as if to accentuate their disobedience. And nobody has said that they recognize what these letters are, so I assume that nobody knows what these are, which means that I'll explain them slightly to you to make it a little bit clearer. As you can see, we can see Aksara characters written here on this letter. Actually, it turns out that this particular one is a combination of Caronese Batak and Pakpak texts. So they're actually mixed up texts. These letters are pretty interesting. So according to some historians, these letters are called pulas. And they are announcing something. And when you want to announce something in this context, you leave one of these collections of objects in the place so that somebody can find it. In this case, I think that they would leave one of these collections of bamboo and things in a drying barn overnight. And in this particular context, these things are called musuh berengin, musuh arem. So enemy by night, enemy by day. And that is a phenomenon that we'll talk about in a second. But the environmental historian, Faiza Zakaria, she is an environmental historian at National University of Singapore. She points out that the Batak literacy is a way of communication. So you communicate with friends or with lovers or with maybe your wife or your partner, and you also communicate with the ancestors, and you communicate with the things that you can't see, the keramat spirits that live in the forest. So, and these can relate to. Faisal Zakaria explains that these things can relate to all kinds of things: objects, plants, trees, land. Of course, when you have the plantation system coming in, the perkebunan, they're messing all of this up. All of these relationships, all of these ancestors, all of these relationships between people and plants and animals are totally getting messed up. And in 1871, when Grob and Neher both started buying plantations, that is exactly what happened. And totally changed this system. And of course, this is also around the time historically when Christian missionaries also start to arrive. They start to come to Tanakaro. They are already arrived in Lake Toba, and this is also changing things. So there is a new system. So I actually, I was very interested in these letters because nobody knew what they said. So I got in touch with somebody who is working as an expert on Indonesian languages, and he helped me translate one of these letters. He's a scholar, he's a linguist called Uli Kozok. And he said that one of these letters is saying this. Don't you not give me back Terikat in Kutajurung, so a village at the edge of the plantation? If you don't return her, I will burn Tuan's house, Kusulu Rumah Tuan. And it even says, I will kill people. My village is far away in Pakpak. Kutaku dua I Pakpak. So this was what the letter said, and I was like, wow, okay, I didn't really expect this. This is and of course, the professor that helped me with this, Kozok, Prof. Kozok, he was like, I don't know any of the context, but this is roughly what it's transliterating as. And he was very careful to say transliterating, not translation, because translation is also the meaning. We don't really know the meaning. We're not really sure about the context, so it's very difficult to know. But what we do know for sure is that there's not one of these letters, there's 4 of them. And we do know that these letters were left behind by the people that owned the Patumbak plantation. So we know. What we also know is that when we look at the map from 1884, of course, this is what the map used to look like. You can see, we're looking at the coastline, the shore. We can see Medan here in the sort of central. We can even see these new red lines, and that's the train line which they're going to build. They're going to build Kuala Namu, the airport, out here in 100 years, but they're not done it yet. And we can also see roughly the exact location of the Patumbak plantation, so the region that Groban Neha leased, and that was called the Senemba Company, the Senemba Matkape. And here we see, I zoomed in a little bit, you can see Senemba, and if you follow all the way down, roughly where Kutajurang is right at the corner. I'm not actually sure on this map if it even says Kutajurang, but I double checked this on a more contemporary map just to match the exact location. So this is kind of interesting. So we know that Grobanese plantations, they go right up to the border. And when I'm saying border, I mean this big red line. And the big red line is the edge of the Dutch residency. So this is something, of course, many of you are familiar with, that the Dutch residency is pointing out basically where the Europeans can go and where they can't go. Of course, they can't go here to the Bataclandan. And here we can even see, it's very nice, you can see Sibayak here, the big hills which are surrounding. So we know already we're in the mountains. By this point, we're pretty far into the mountains. And we know that it was probably quite challenging terrain. Here you can see the name Patumbak. So we know that this also, when Karl Grob returns to Zurich in 1881 or so, this was just before this map was published. He's already spent a decade in Sumatra, and his business partner, Hermann Neher, he returns to another town called Lindau in Germany, not far from Switzerland. Neher gives all of these things, these objects, to the Zurich Geographical Society, and they then give this to the museum. And this is how I saw these letters, these Musu Bungin, Musu Adin letters. So I think it's also, probably a bunch of you have already been up Sibayak this year, gone to the top. You know, it's a really popular destination, and people leave offerings still today. You know, it's like it's a gesture of respect to the mountain. I really like the work of an anthropologist called Mary Margaret Steedley. Just type her name in the chat because she's a very interesting anthropologist. And she says that the borderland of official order, stories of spirits, bandits, and outlaws evade the anonymity of continuity and trade and change. She says that Sibayak is the gateway to the Karo Plateau and also the home to the Keramat, or at least back, especially back in 1871. There are a big mixture of accounts of what Keramat spirits are, what they do. You know, historians sort of discuss this, and you know, it's related to how people even see the land of Sibayak now, is, you know, whether it's good for farming and so on. So it's useful for us to think, and this is the view from Sibayak now, for us to think about how Sibayak and how this relationship works. And I took this photograph because I also wanted to see actually how close did the Patumbak, the Grobanese plantations come, and they come, you know, they're right there. They really come very close to the Batak Plateau, the Karo Plateau, Tanah. So after Karl Grob returns from Sumatra in 1879 and commissioned the large Villa Patumba on the shores of Lake Zurich, he died. He actually died in 1892 of a tropical disease. They didn't leave the name at the time. And he left his villa, he left and his inheritance to his wife and daughters. And they gave away the house to charity, the Villa Patumba. So it's not an unusual story, but you know, that's part of what happened. They said, okay, we don't want this house anymore. So to return to this sort of relationship, Pulas often demand, you know, they at this time in the late 19th century, having these sort of texts written in Batak, they could announce something. They could announce a debt or an outstanding wage, and they, you know, according to Uli Kozok, he says that they would often demand the return of a child or a payment, or and they also have these miniature things, the miniature objects attached, weapons, figures, fire-making kits to reinforce a threat. So they were a way to publicly announce something. And in many ways, they were a kind of legal institution, a legal institution for announcing something. So the practice of Pulas could also imply a change of state in a person. Mary, the anthropologist I mentioned, Mary Margaret Steedley, she mentions this as well. She says that it's called a musubergen because the person actually becomes a musubergen, a musubergen musu arya, an enemy at nighttime, an enemy in the daytime. And this person who has announced this has sort of become an outlaw from society, a fugitive, and maybe they're even transformed into a spirit until the matter is settled. So one colonial account notes that these letters would be written so that even the letter is written as if it's written from a dead person, as if somebody's already passed into this different state. And so there's this change in state happening. The letter as well, I think that this is so fascinating, an architectural angle, is that the letter is left inside a building. It's left in a doorway. So it also transforms the building around it. So So this is why it was very interesting to me when I saw that exact letter in a museum recently. I saw it next to a spell book. Oh, there appears to be some red writing on the screen now. Interesting. I don't know how that happened. Okay. I saw this letter in a museum in Switzerland, in Zurich, in a big exhibition called Colonial. And I was, I was like, I know this object, and I was not surprised to see it in the exhibition, but I was surprised to see that there was no explanation of it. They just left it there next to a pustaha, example of a pustaha, a spell book. I thought it's kind of strange to leave something like this and then not really explain it in the museum. A little bit scary in a way, a little bit strange. And I think that there is something about these objects which also have a transformation potential. The historian and curator Francois Verger, type her name in chat so that you can see, because it's a little bit difficult to spell, but the historian and curator Francois Verger, she says that when an object enters the museum, it dies. The object passes. And she says that a museum is a graveyard for previously living things. She says that when objects taken under conditions of theft and land and colonial disappropriation, and then they're separated from the environment, they naturalize colonization's violence. But on the other hand, this object was not stolen. It was actually intentionally given to a European or a master or tuan. It seems to naturalize something else. It's doing something else. Was this Musu Berengin period of the sender, was this ever resolved, I wondered? Or did the case stay open? Did it come back to Zurich even? And so we could say that the object now, it naturalizes a new Swiss and European environment to the struggle, this clash of worlds, its origin of its identity. If only the audience could understand what it said, because there was no explanation. And so with that, I will stop talking. I will also stop sharing, and we come back to the grid of faces. And I hope that that was okay and understandable. I'm very curious to know if people have questions or feedback or comments. I'm very grateful. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Will. It was wonderful and enlightening for us. And yeah, I think most of the students understand in English, but I will make some point to them. And before a few days ago, I also share your article about I will burn to one house. I think also they read it. And yes, jadi Will tadi menyampaikan beberapa bagaimana Swiss itu punya koloni di Sumatera Timur, kemudian dia juga menjelaskan villa Patumba. Nah, ada hal yang unik di sini, di mana orang Swiss ini menamai perkebunannya dengan Patumba gitu, nama lokal, dan membangun villa di Zurich di Swiss. Dan tadi juga dia menjelaskan detail arsitektur villa Patumbanya. Dan tadi juga disampaikan ada beberapa manuskrip kuno itu bukan hasil rampasan, melainkan pemberian secara sukarela. Ya, mungkin kalau ada pertanyaan, silakan. I think Will, there is 2 questions in the chat column. Would you like me to translate the first one?
It's okay. I already translated the first one,
Okay,
but I
that is
don't think it's a
great.
question.
It's from
Rasyid, maybe I'm on the last. Okay, the last question
Okay.
from me.
Okay, Pak Jainal. Okay.
Firstly, our
Resti-
student.
Okay. Thank you. I think Resti Budiati she's a student at postgraduate of history at USU. Yes.
Okay,
So you can answer the first question.
great. So there is one question from Tiara Lubis that I see in the chat. It says, in your
Yes.
opinion, sir, how can villa as estate approach broaden our understanding of colonial architecture and its material legacy in European cities. I think it's I'm not sure exactly how to understand the question, but I think that it really depends on what you're interested in discussing, what type of material you're interested in discussing. I do think that in this example, it was very useful for me to come across these objects in the archive, which made the history more complicated, actually. It's not a simple story of Europeans, they mess up the land, they make some money, they go home again, they make something fancy in Europe. We know that story. I also think what's interesting about this is that we can read some information from the other side. And in this case, we read the information from the Batak Karo side, because that's where the plantations were hitting onto. So that was the geographical region, which makes it quite, it's a very unusual story. You don't often have the chance to read that. So I think that there is also an interesting project there to translate what do people think about this in the time, not just Europeans. The Europeans wrote lots of things and we know what they said. They wrote lots of letters, they wrote lots of books and stories, and we've read this, but actually local people, they were also writing to each other. So it's really interesting. Okay. Oh, that's another question from Kiki. Silicon isn't that headed cool? Yeah. Oh,
No,
it's
for
checklist. You
Yeah.
got to write your.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. But that's also important. Yeah. Bagaimana sejarah bangunan?
There is
Okay.
also questions from Ayu Sidurian.
Yeah, that's a good
Yeah.
question. Yeah. I think it's a great question. I think it's super important to understand, especially in the Indonesian context where we have so much knowledge and understanding of the Dutch, the Netherlands, and of course, it's not just the Dutch. They were really just managing a bigger system. I think that it's also really important to think about smaller things. If you would allow me to talk a little bit more broadly, I would say that we're very stuck in the mindset of the nation state. We really think about nation states as this ordering system, like Dutch, Indonesian, French, Russian, Japanese, whatever. But in the 19th century, that was quite a new idea. That was not fully. It was still an emerging concept, and I think that if we think about history through individuals and smaller groups of people, it's much more accurate. You can see how, yeah, sure, you have the Dutch, they have small private armies. The Swiss also have small private armies. So the Sultan also, these small people have small sort of paramilitaries and smaller conflict ways of organizing conflict. So I think that the Swiss example is just an example to show how much more complicated it really is to talk about. It's not as simple as colonizer colonized, but there's a lot of people who are taking advantage of this system. Yeah, so I would say that this is important as a historical fact. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Will. Apa ada lagi yang mau bertanya secara langsung? Ada lagi
Vicky.
yang lain? Kiki. Would you like to ask question?
Cool, good question. Kiki in there with the hard questions. Thank you very much. So I appreciate this question, even though it's difficult to answer. First off, we have to design a time machine so that we can go back in time, and then we can, figure out the next steps, do some ethnographic work. I think so. We know for a fact that the communities were very connected. People had their ethnic status, and their ethnicity was very defining for how they were in the society. The white people stay in the white people place, the local Malays stay in their own villages, Batak people have their own villages. That we know that there is this, but I also think that people were very connected. This is they had to be. They're doing business together all the time. You have to hire. Oh, I need a new house over there. Like, I'm going to hire somebody who has the expertise. People had to communicate. They had to talk to each other. So there were lots of interconnections. And because I'm very interested in visual material, like photographs and plans and drawings and things, I've looked at a lot of photographs, and you can see that in order to become close to taking a photograph of people, you also have to have some familiarity and to be able to talk to them, to ask them to do different things. So I think that there was, and you also have unusual colonial accounts of some people who really were quite integrated. So who really spent a lot of time, even in the highlands, even in Tanakara or somewhere. Yeah, I think architectural legacies depends how far back you want to go in time. If you're building a building out of natural materials, then it will inevitably decay. So if you build a building out of non-natural materials like concrete or steel, it'll take a long time to decay. So maybe you're looking for other things. Maybe you're looking for other traces to see this. You can. I think that you also have your own approach to this.
Okay, thank you, Kiki and Will. And ada lagi yang mau bertanya? I think there is also students from University of Gajah Mada here attending with us. Laila, I think. Ada lagi yang mau bertanya? Kalau tidak ada, Pak Jainan.
Hold up, Miss Rashid.
Okay. Pandu, silakan Pandu.
Well, dear Mr. Willis, can I ask you a personal question?
Sure.
Well, can I ask you what kind of motivation that encouraged you to did researches about North Sumatra?
Good question. My answer is because one day I was walking around in Zurich and I saw this crazy house and I thought, whoa, where did this house come from? It's totally, I knew already. I was like, oh, wow, I want to learn about this house. That's how. So the more I learned, I realized, okay, I have to learn more about Sumatra. If I want to know about Switzerland, I have to learn about Sumatra. If I want to learn about this history, not just in Zurich, then I have to also know the backstory. That's why.
Lovely answer, sir. Thank you.
So, yeah, that's just how it goes.
Oke, apa ada lagi?
There
Kalau
is
Thank
tidak
you.
also,
ada,
Thank you for the
I think
question.
there is also question in the chat. All of the questions
Jainal,
already? No. There is also question from the chat.
yang mana ya Pak Jainal?
From Resti, for example, from Resti already answered. Not yet, I think.
I think we'll Pak Jainal asking about the first question from Resti. This is not in Subang is not in Sumatra, it's in the West Java.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with Hofland, Peter William Hofland.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll look that up because that sounds like it would be a very interesting case in Subang in west of Java. Is that whereabouts? And
Yes, in the
I'll have
west
to
of
look it up.
Java. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Esther Sihombing has a question. Thank you, Esther. Can you explain the role of opium use in social and economic lives of plantation workers and its impact on tobacco production that financed Villa Patumba? Yeah, there's some excellent research about this. Give me 1 second and I will find the article about it because it's a very important aspect of this history, and other people have written about it much more. I've only researched a small amount. It's hugely influential because people rely on it. It is a drug that has the effect on your body that you don't feel so much pain, and you don't feel tired. And so people were relying on it to work for longer hours in that context. And that was also true in cities like Singapore, where the manual laborers were also relying on opium. And I think I'll mention the article, which is called Madat Makan Orang, Opium Eats People, and it's by Abdul Wahid. I'm guessing Rashid and Kiki Malana Afandi are familiar with this article. It's very good for this history. It's called Opium Eats People, Opium Addiction as a Public Health Issue in Late Colonial Java. And I can just type that quickly into the chat so that you have that. It's a very useful text for that part of the history, because of course, later on, even after 1920, it's gone. I think it sort of starts to become eradicated. Next question from Dina Christiani. How does the use of Southeast Asian Chinese cultural motifs in the architecture of Villa Patumba reflect colonial views for culture? Fantastic question. I love the specificity. And I realized that in this presentation, I didn't actually show any images of the interior of the Villa Patumba, and specifically what they called as the Malay courtyard. So let me just show you a picture of that, if you don't mind me sharing my screen one more time. Because it reflects it absolutely reflects how people thought about. Here we go. So you see my screen. I'm just going to see more images, and let's get a nice zoomed in one of this. So this is what was called the Malayan courtyard, and it's just a big jumble of ideas about Asia at the time. It's not historically accurate. Recently I've begun researching more of the architects that designed this house. And the year before they designed this house, they designed a huge world exhibition. And in that exhibition, they had to also design lots of other cultures. So I think that this is, you can see the little dragons here. You even see the dragons on the wallpaper. The column, everything is very, very colorful. And it was called the Malayan courtyard, the Malayischen Innenhof, because it was like a Chinese courtyard house. That was the idea. And in this image, maybe this is also clear, that you see the glass at the top. You see that the glass is very colorful. And the idea is it lets in lots of light, a lot of colorful light. You can see these sort of almost like Japanese screen motifs here on the back wall. The other thing that I would point out, if there's anybody that's able to read Chinese script, these pieces of text don't make any sense at all. It's totally random. I mean, you sort of have like a couple of like jumbly bits of information, but this is not written by somebody that reads Chinese or writes Chinese. So it's quite an interesting thing, because the architects are doing, they're clearly, the architects are a little bit in a fantasy world. They know they want to write some Chinese text. They don't know how to write it, but they'll put it on there anyway. Yeah, so that's a really interesting example. I encourage you to look up the villa. You know, it's a pretty fascinating place. So now the questions are coming in.
Yes.
Sure. Okay. So a question from Sabeth Devani. How did the colonial government use policies such as transmigration to support the expansion of plantation capitalism by providing human resources, and what impact did this have on the transmigrated communities? I mean, huge. I mean, that's really the history of like Medan and so many other places in the world. I think that there was, I mean, there's a lot you could say. I think in the to be very specific about this particular example, is that the colonial government used these policies because it was a very efficient way of making people work and forcing them to work. Because if you remove a person and say, or let's just say, I say to you, hey, how about you come and work here? It's a really great job here, and you can, you know, you'll make a lot of money, and then you can go back to where you came from. But to come here, I'm going to give you a loan, and then you come because you think, oh, it's great, I get a loan, I can already start working. But then it takes you so long to pay off that loan that maybe you're there for 3 years or 5 years. It's not really a gift anymore. It's actually indentured labor. And this is, of course, the story of so many places. This was a big system. This is what forced the. I would say that it was a form of. It was not all forced migration, although some was, but it was a very. What's the right word for this? It was a very crafty technique. It was a technique of labor management that was taking advantage of people who were poor, you know, taking advantage of poverty in some places and removing them from there and to put them. And I think that it had there's many things that can be said. It's, you know, it's a sort of human activity for you know, hundreds of years. And by this stage, it was a very sophisticated system. Maria Hutapea has a question. Were there any cases of human rights violations on plantations? Yes, there were many. Many examples of that. And some, you know, there's famous examples from from Kramer, the infamous sort of Dutch plantation owner. Even the example of the letter which I showed. This, I would say, was a pretty normal case. The plantations were operating rumah tutup, like a closed room, like essentially a prison, like a mini prison, where they could keep people hostage, and that was a known phenomenon in the 19th century. So for sure there were human rights violations on the plantations. And I think, you know, there's a lot of literature about that I can point you to, but it's a known thing. Rena comes in with a question: how the magnificent Villa Patumba Villa illustrates the connection between luxury in Europe and the hard lives of workers in the Patumba. Great question. Great question. I think I wanted to talk about this part of my presentation. I'm going to share my screen again. I hope you don't mind, because I really like this question, and I think that it's an important question. Let me just make it so I can see people again. So where are we? I was talking about this particular part of the house because I think that this illustrates the connection. I think that the poverty and the difficulties of plantation life and people relying on opium smoking, even if that was a small minority of people, was enough to illustrate how difficult the conditions were. That translates back into this house through the naming of this architectural example, like this. It's basically a piece of fun for the architects. They say, oh, we call it the dragon's eye, and it makes you think about smoke, like chasing the dragon, and the dragon being somehow this motif. You start to see that there's actually a sinister connection here between what's really happening on the ground and the sort of fantasy of what's happening back in Europe. And it's not always so easy to see those relationships, and that's why I really appreciate the question. I think that they're a little bit in hidden layers. So that's I appreciate that question. Thank you for it.
Okay, thank you, Will. And masih ada lagi yang mau bertanya? Kalau tidak ada, mungkin bisa kita akhiri.
The last question, I think. The last question.
Okay, Pak Jainal.
Yeah,
Silakan.
it is my only curiosity.
Yeah.
About, the research about the architecture, it's only for the building that made from the bricks or something, because in your presentation there is no picture about the house of the worker labor in that area, how far you just only show us the picture of the hut. It is for the drying the tobacco leaves, but
yeah,
how far from the worker house, and then what is the model of the worker house? You are not talking about that. Why it is not including our architecture research, or it is not your concern or something like that?
Okay, great question. I'm just typing it into the chat so that as a reminder. Thank you, Janelle Abidin. I really appreciate this question. On this particular presentation, I'm focusing on one story. I'm very interested in how people were living in buildings which were not made of brick and stone and concrete and mortar. And I've done a lot of research, actually, also especially into how people use plants and building types: bamboo, nipa palm, sago palm, coconut, these different materials. I will talk about them in a different lecture. Also, I think in the next lecture, I will get more chance to talk about this, because you really need. I wanted to focus on one story, and so that's why I didn't cover everything. I also think that there is a bigger aspect to your question, which is really fascinating, is that why when we talk about architecture, we don't always think about the soft architecture, the plant materials, the smaller case studies, the smaller examples. So how did what are the little stories in this? How did people live? How did they make their houses? What was their livelihood like? Not everything was a permanent building. Sometimes, people they live in the fields for a couple of days, and then they go back to the village, and they spend time there. And there's a big difference between those settlements. So there's a lot to discuss in that question. And I think that there's a big problem in architecture only concerning itself with the hard materials, the heavy materials, Rome, Paris. We know the examples, we know that's also a problem of Eurocentrism, Eurocentric understanding of architecture. So, and I like to think about this in like hard and heavy materials versus soft and light materials. Sometimes the soft materials have the heaviest history, and vice versa. So I think that there's a lot to discuss there, especially in the tropical context. And I concern myself with that in other research projects as well. So I look forward to discussing that.
Thank you for
Yes.
your explanation.
Thank you.
I think that is the last question for today, and thank you for all the questions. And Will, thank you so much for enlightening us with a wonderful presentation. And see you on the next guest lecture in 22 September. And
Okay.
okay, thank you for.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you, Will.
Very much look forward to the next round. Yeah, thank you. Have a good day,
still in the
everybody.
morning, right? Yes, have a good day.
Yes, it's the morning here. Yeah, sampai jumpa. Yeah.
Sampai jumpa.
Yeah, terima kasih. Sama-sama.